Today's story is about a person who boldly spoke out and kicked out her mother, who was obsessed with alcohol and men and didn't take care of her daughter, but demanded repayment for raising her. Can there be another mother like this in the world? It seems she doesn't know that if she does something inhuman and expects a reward, she will pay a heavy price. Let's take a look together. Please subscribe and like our channel.
Hello. I'm a woman who needs advice because of my family, not my in-laws. I'm currently pregnant and have been married for 3 years. We both worked for about 2 years to save more money, and we delayed having a baby. My husband and I both love children, so this baby is something we've been eagerly waiting for.
My husband is kind and caring.
He's extremely gentle to me and a bit cold to others. But I honestly like this side of him more. I vaguely remember living with my grandmother when I was a child. I remember scenes where my mother seemed to have a lot of conflict with my grandmother. My grandmother was harsh on my mother because I was her daughter. My mother couldn't stand it and divorced. And I lived with my mother and my maternal grandmother. But my mother's behavior was the problem after that. She left me with my grandmother and went out to meet men. As a child, my wish was to sleep with my mother, but she went out to drink every night, so I hardly had a chance to sleep with her. Most of the time, I saw my mother sleeping when I was preparing for school. I ended up living with my mother when my uncle took my grandmother in. My mother lived with a man, but I remember at least 3 men in my memory. I hardly received any allowance since middle school. The money I received from adults when I met relatives was all. I was always lonely because my mother was not at home. My mother seemed to be a person who considered going out to drink and hanging out with men more important than her daughter. Drinking, dating, I guess these were the most important things for my mother. In high school, I met my mother's boyfriend at a barbecue restaurant, and he gave me an allowance. He also gave money to my mother. Seeing my mother flattering him and taking the money, I thought, so my mother can smile like that. Of course, my mother took the allowance I received from the man. I started working part-time since I was in the 3rd year of middle school. I saved and saved money. I continued to save money while working part-time in high school. And the reason I saved money like that was because I wanted to become independent quickly. As soon as I graduated from high school, I got a job, and I was able to become independent at the age of 21. When I told my mother that I would become independent and live alone, she told me to pay her back for raising me and then leave. I thought about giving my mother some of the money I had saved from my young heart. But my friend told me never to do that, and if I did, she wouldn't see me. So I left without giving my mother any money. I didn't know anything about men, because I had been working part-time since middle school and living in a rush. There were men who approached me, but I thought there was no reason for them to like someone like me, so I pushed them all away. In my mid-20s, I met my husband and started dating. After a long dating period, we got married. My husband was always a man who waited for me, and when I told him stories from my childhood, he was a man who got excited by himself and blushed. I really liked that. Maybe I liked the man who got angry for me, who had a lot of anger about my family piled up in my heart, and never expressed that anger. When we were getting married, my in-laws said they would help with the house costs. But I said I absolutely couldn't accept it. I was grateful enough that they accepted someone like me as a daughter-in-law, so I couldn't accept their money. Upon hearing this, my mother-in-law cried for a few days. My husband had told her a bit about my situation. Hearing that my mother-in-law cried, saying that I seemed to have grown up well despite my environment, I also spent a few days in tears. After becoming independent, I only saw my mother on holidays. The only communication we had was 4 or 5 phone calls a year. When getting married, I couldn't even dream of getting support from my mother. And I was actually relieved that my mother didn't give me money to get married. That's why I couldn't accept the money my in-laws offered to help. When I told her I was getting married, my mother said we should have a formal meeting of both families. I knew my mother, so I had no intention of holding such a meeting. As expected, my mother said she could just bring the man. She was seeing to the meeting, and I was certain that my mother would bring up money at the meeting. I didn't even want to think about it. So I told my husband the truth, and my in-laws, who knew my situation, respected my decision with a heart touch. They didn't even mention the traditional money gift for the bride. I wanted to give them the money gift in some way, but I thought it was not polite to do so as I had saved about the same amount of money as my husband. But my mother asked for a suit for her and her boyfriend. I told my mother not to come to the wedding if she was going to do that. My mother cursed at me, calling me ungrateful. Did I owe my mother anything? Should I consider it a great favor that she didn't starve me? These were the only thoughts I had. After getting married, I couldn't understand my mother. More and more as I watched my in-laws. I initially found it very awkward, and even embarrassing to receive their kindness, considering it's something parents should do for their children. So I couldn't understand my mother even more. My mother said she divorced because of her life with her mother-in-law. But I even doubted if that was true. My husband has 2 younger brothers. The second youngest brother treats me with respect, but the youngest brother speaks to me informally. Even when he gets scolded by my in-laws, the youngest brother who speaks informally to me is very cute to me. When I told my in-laws that I was pregnant, not only my in-laws but also my brothers-in-law called me, saying they were so happy to finally see their nephew and thanked me. And they sent baby products together. One day, I was so busy receiving packages all day. My in-laws said they were sorry for not helping when we got married, and would like to pay for the hospital and postpartum care center. But my brothers-in-law said, "Then what about our honor as uncles? Mom will take care of the hospital expenses, and we will split the postpartum care center expenses." But my mother seemed to expect something from me when I got married. And she didn't even congratulate me when I said I was pregnant. As a woman, I've tried hard to understand my mother. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't understand. My brothers-in-law were so happy to hear about their nephew. But how could my mother treat me, her daughter, like that? The attention and love from my in-laws was initially awkward, but as I gradually got used to it, I couldn't understand my mother even more. Last summer, my mother called me often. It was strange to me that my mother was asking me how I was doing, how the baby was growing in my belly. My mother worries about me? I had such thoughts and my mind was very complicated. Has my mother changed as she got older? Did my mother get some bad disease? I had all kinds of thoughts. But in the end, the reason my mother called me was to talk about money. My mother broke up with her boyfriend. My mother is the type who changes boyfriends often. So I didn't think much of it when she told me. But suddenly, she started talking about money. She then said she was planning to start a small business to make a living, opening a bar with a friend, but they were short on money. That was the gist of it. We live without any financial help from both families. So I asked her where she thought we would get the money. Even if we did have it, I firmly said I had no intention of giving it to her, and again, she called me an ungrateful wretch. I want to ask all of you, am I really an ungrateful daughter? Even after I declined several times and stopped taking her calls, my mother eventually called my husband. My husband, after receiving my Mother's call said he would discuss it with me first. But my mother told him not to tell me anything and just give her the money. My husband hesitated before telling me this. And I was so angry that I yelled at my husband. I should have declined immediately. I yelled at my husband for why he needed to discuss it. I regret that I took out my unjustified anger on my husband. I struggled for a few days due to my guilty feelings towards my husband and anger at my mother. Then my mother came to our house. She sat down with my husband and me and talked about money. She started saying how she raised me, how she struggled alone to raise me without a father. Then she asked to borrow money. My husband sat silently, watching me and my mother. I interrupted my mother's speech and spoke out. I told her about the things she did. She was always drunk, meeting men when I was a kid. She never gave me an allowance. She brought 3 different men into the house, calling them my new dad. She harassed me for money when I moved out. She made a fuss for money when I got married. And so on. My mother said I was exaggerating. I said I wish it was an exaggeration. But these are all true. And I hate it too, I said. When I told my husband about my mother, he said my mother was not even human. I live receiving love from my in-laws and my brothers-in-law. But I feel like my happiness will be ruined if my mother acts like this. So I decided not to see my mother from now on. I told her not to contact me anymore. I said I would block her number, and if she came here again, we would move. Whether my mother tells my in-laws that I am a bad daughter or not, I don't care anymore, I told her. I screamed at her to get out immediately. My mother cursed at me. Let's see how well you live after abandoning your parents. When she said that, I said I would call the police if she didn't leave immediately. And my husband also yelled at her to leave immediately. After my mother left, my husband was watching me. But I couldn't say anything, so I apologized to my husband the next day. My husband said he wished I wouldn't struggle. He said he wished I could do whatever I want as long as it doesn't harm others. So I wouldn't struggle and be happy, so I said I would definitely do that. My husband must have told my mother-in-law, because she came to see me a few days later. She seemed like she wanted to say something but couldn't. And she seemed to be watching me, so I told her everything that had happened. My mother-in-law said, "Our baby shouldn't be sad." And she cried while listening to me. Is there another mother in the world who asks for repayment for raising her child just because she didn't starve her? Even though she's a mother like this, should I be filial? Because she gave birth to me and raised me? If I did something wrong, I wish you would tell me.
No, you didn't do anything wrong. You did well. It must have taken a tremendous amount of effort not to become twisted and grow upright in such an environment. You deserve praise just for that fact alone. Thank you for growing up well.